When George Washington was elected president on April 30th, 1789, the United States had vital decisions to make that would affect its future prosperity and growth as a newly unified nation. In the midst of dealing with the subsequent debt and instability in government from the American Revolution and from the Articles of Confederation, the United States had to make a name for itself and regain its trust with its political and economic allies. Most important to the United States during this time was its alliance with France, which was established on February 6, 1778. In order to gain the respect that the United States deserved, Washington sought the aid of Gouverneur Morris, an American statesman and diplomat who at the time was the U.S. ambassador in France. The correspondence between the two, which lasted over several months, was in regard to the diplomatic status of the United States and France. The communication between President Washington and Morris during the time when Morris was in France played a crucial role in the rebuilding of the United States' prominent status. At the time Washington and Morris were corresponding, France was undergoing a revolution. Governor Morris took it upon his liberty to address George Washington of these current events in Europe through a series of multiple letters. These letters, which hint at an imminent or upcoming war between revolutionary France, Austria, and Britain, put into perspective the opportunities that the U.S. had to make a better representation of itself. As Gouverneur Morris overtly explains to Washington in his initial letter from November 22nd, 1790, the United States must approach as nearly as possible to our comprehension the view of futurity and bestow on the present that cool consideration. If a war were to break out between European nations, especially between France and Great Britain, Washington knew that it would make American diplomacy difficult when it came to choosing a side because of its several political and commercial connections. Knowing that any consequence from this change of systems, which have so long prevailed in Europe, would potentially benefit or hinder the prosperity of the United States, Washington's response to Gouverneur Morris on July 28, 1791, portrayed in the best interest of the potential future for the United States that America must carefully consider connections with any European power. In saying this, Washington was specifically concerned of the growing conflict between Great Britain and France, since France was one of the United States' most significant allies. However, even though it would be inferred that the United States would readily take the French side in the case of war, Washington ultimately advocated for America to remain neutral in his letter. The main purpose of Washington's letter was to agree and to some extent reassure Gouverneur Morris of the accuracy he portrayed of the foreign events being the gateway for the United States to achieve a new yet stronger reputation. In the beginning of the letter, Washington discusses how Gouverneur Morris's speculations regarding the changes in Europe would undoubtedly affect us in a degree proportioned to our political or commercial connections with the several nations of it, claiming that a system of change will open a view of things, and we shall burst upon them as if it were with redoubled chances. The impressions of the United States, of which had been plagued by a history of war and political instability, would have never been removed if Europe remained the same way as it was. Ever since the United States achieved its independence from Great Britain in 1776, Washington and United States government were seen in the eyes as Europeans as a reflection of their nation's bad past. If the United States was not known for its distresses caused by the American Revolution, then it was seen as its disagreements impeded the country from obtaining an organized, stable foundation for a future government. However, since Washington agreed with Gouverneur Morris in his concerns about the future of the U.S., this gave justification to Gouverneur Morris's concerns about acknowledging and taking advantage of these foreign affairs. Washington wanted to show France, through the administration of Gouverneur Morris, that the U.S. was not a weak nation, but rather a nation on its way to excellence and importance. Although Washington agreed with Gouverneur Morris that the present events would play an important role in achieving prominent status, Washington made sure to advise in the letter not to be too involved in foreign disputes. He trusted that we shall never so far lose sight of our own interest and happiness in order to get drawn into a party into their political disputes. Although an opportunity like this arose for the United States, Washington brought the expectations back to a realistic and guarded level. He was aware of the multitude of events occurring and the opportunities that the United States had, but explained that the outcomes were beyond the ken of mortal foresight to determine what the rest of those changes will be. Washington stressed for a beneficial outcome from the termination of these affairs for the United States and in the favor of rights of man. By saying this, he also expressed remorse for our European brethren, making his intentions in his letter seem less patriotic. By referring to the Europeans as brethren in order to convey a sense of unity between Americans and Europeans, Washington regarded the affairs in Europe as something that would never be longed for, but at the moment when his country was prospering and needed it, it was the only opportunity the U.S. had. Following this position established in the opening paragraphs, Washington began to dig deeper into what it really meant for the United States to remain neutral in the current during the affairs in Europe. Washington raised awareness at the fact that it was conceivable, although not desirable, that the U.S. would form new connections with European powers, even when it was trying to stay impartial. Washington addressed that if this occurred, every connection had to be considerably thought out in relation to the growing importance of the U.S. as a nation. Similarly, if a treaty should be formed with any European nation who at the time may be seen with defeat written in its near future, the United States had to prove that there was no intention of enjoining with this nation in hopes of just unfair advantages. Washington intended to demonstrate a universal theory directed specifically at the United States government and American citizens when he claimed the party taking advantage of the distresses of another will lose infinitely more in the opinion of mankind and in subsequent events than he will gain by the stroke of the moment. If the U.S. were to have overstepped in these affairs, it would consequently be brought in as an ally, and therefore the U.S. was looking at another war with another set of responsibilities and consequences after. Remaining neutral in the case of these events was what Washington believed to be the best bet for the United States and an opportunity to remake itself. Besides addressing the concerns to how the United States would benefit from foreign affairs, Washington shifted onto the increasing stability and growth of the country. In order for the U.S. to prove itself as an important nation, it needed evidence of its domestic success. In a previous tour of the southern states, George Washington recounts the patent signs of success within the general government in that part of the Union. The citizens felt secured and felt that they had equal justice administered to them. Washington writes, "The farmer, the merchant, and the mechanic have seen their several interests attended to." Specifically mentioning these three different occupations serves to highlight the range of economic success within the U.S. Here, Washington intended to show the progress that the United States was making. The growth of success of the economy allowed for the aspiring nation to alleviate some of the debt on its shoulders from the American Revolution and show France just how well the U.S. was really becoming. Washington made it another point to acknowledge the U.S.'s establishment of public credit and its population numbers. Confidence in government had increased due to the rapidity with which the subscriptions to the Bank of the United States were filled and the unceasing growth of the resources of our citizens. Washington addressed in his previous letter written to Gouverneur Morris regarding the number of inhabitants in the country, which was originally wrong. After the return of the consensus, Washington elucidated to Morris that the numbers were not that small, but that many people were most likely excluded from the list due to religious reasons or out of a fear that the consensus was actually a proposal for a new tax. The prosperity in economic and populations in the U.S., according to Washington, has no small influence in enabling them to form a more just opinion of the present and growing importance than has yet been entertained there. Washington left this letter on an optimistic note to ensure that after all the points discussed, the United States would prevail as a significant power.